all these things I'm trying to get you to understand. So this is a map from Indiana. And it's an anecdotal map, which I just love this map. This is drawn by a local historian. It could have been done by anyone in this room who wanted to really, sort of explain what's going on in your community. And he is identifying all of the AME churches in Indiana. They're not precisely drawn, but this map helped me understand the geography of resistance that I'm talking about. So I took this map, I took 5 maps. This map, a county map, a map of the Underground Railroad, another map of black settlements, and one more map that I can't remember at this point. 5 maps that I laid out, superimposed them all, because I couldn't make the kind of argument that I wanted to make using texts. I did not have the kind of evidence that one would need to make a credible argument because it wasn't written. But when I laid one map on the other, and when I showed, and it's in the book, by the way, which I should lift up, I think. It's in the book, and you'll see it's got a map on the cover, but inside the book, what I've learned is that even though I'm talking about Indiana, you all have come back, my audiences have come back and said, oh, you know what? This is happening here. Let me tell you what's going on down at Highland Beach. Let me tell you what's going on in other parts of the country, because the geography, just like I'm talking about in North Carolina, hasn't really changed. That geographic signature hasn't really changed. So I took these 5 maps and began to craft an argument about the Underground Railroad. One of the arguments is that these black communities are often in tandem with Quaker communities, which is why Sandy Spring is a perfect place for me to come. So that what's been happening in the sort of national narrative is that the geographers plotted the path of the white churches, and they were right. But what they missed was that 2 miles outside, 1.5 miles away, 2 miles away, in a kind of radius, are these black communities. And when I started to superimpose these maps, what did you see? That the paths converge. And so as we learn how to think about this history in a new way, think about these black communities and the power that they actually have and that they bring forward, we start to have access to a new understanding and a new way of being. So this is William Paul Quinn on the right, and Elias Hicks on the left. You all know Hicksites? No? No? So Elias Hicks is a noted Quaker. He is from Long Island, from Jericho, Long Island. He is vehemently opposed to slavery. And he is so opposed to slavery that he wouldn't use sugar. He never wanted cotton to touch his body. When he was dying, people reassured him that the blankets that he was wrapped in were not made from slave labor. He was so vehemently opposed to slavery that the Quakers actually had a schism. And so if you know Hicksite Quakers, this is the man who led that faction. There are other schisms in the religion, and it's almost, Levi Coffin, people are being read out of meeting, a term I had not learned until later on, but people are being read out of meeting because, as you may well understand, that the religious position inside of Quakerism was in conflict with the kind of activism that was associated with abolitionism. And so you had to make a choice. And often people's moral choice was in conflict, and they went towards abolition of slavery. So this is Elias Hicks, and this is Paul Quinn. When Paul Quinn first comes to the United States in the early 1800s, it's Elias Hicks out in Jericho, Long Island that takes him in. And I'm telling you this for a reason. This is not a, non sequitur. So we're going someplace with this. So Elias Hicks takes Paul Quinn in. Quinn learns about Quakers. He learns about your structure, how the annual meetings are, how the local meetings are. He learns all of that. He says in his narrative that he had also been influenced by a Quaker woman named Elizabeth Walker. Now, as a researcher, if any of you are doing any genealogy, you know that that is a name that has no distinctive features whatsoever. So when I went to England, I was in Sheffield because that's where she was from, and I was there for a conference. I said, oh, I'll go look for Elizabeth Walker name. They were like, not only is it a common name, it's a very common Quaker name. So her name was Elizabeth Hoyland Walker, and I was able to trace her through the Hoyland. But he was influenced by this Quakeress, and I didn't know about the Quaker missionaries and the women who traveled the world really proselytizing and really coming through for the religion. And so she was supposed to have influenced him. So Paul Quinn has double influences by the Quakers. And we see in Methodism, which he is, he's a Methodist preacher, a lot of the ways in which the Methodists are organized kind of parallel the ways in which Quaker meetings are run, not the silence part, that didn't work. But that in the historical record, you always see the African Americans who, in Christian religion, in the time period that I worked, were banished up into the gallery, and they were told that they couldn't utter not Mary and Amen. So even at that early point, people were punctuating their sermons with amen and affirmation and encouraging you, yes, brother, and they were like, don't talk. So we've seen that these are the kinds of things that, happen inside it. But we read the historical record and you start to see, oh, this is where it began. But Paul Quinn is the fourth bishop of the AME Church. And if you go back one, he's the man that started almost every one of these churches in Indiana.
Wow.
So he is, they call him the Johnny Appleseed of Methodism. He is moving across the country. They call him the militant soldier of the cross. He's actually the subject of my next biography. He's what we call in biographical writing an uncooperative subject. But he starts many of these churches. Next slide. And this is one of them. So this is the little one-room school at Rocky Fork. I did try to see if I could find any original drawings or early depictions of the churches and the schools that would have been here at Sandy Spring, but I did not. And I'm sure you probably have them in your records and archives, but I didn't see them readily available. So this is what I want to talk to you about, particularly for this talk. And so most of my talks are tailored to the audiences I'm speaking to. And for you, I was really interested in talking about education. So we know that in the 19th century, there are anti-literacy laws. Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina. We never found any for the state of Maryland. And so people like to think that this is a great thing. We don't have any anti-literacy laws in Maryland. We don't have anything written on the books. But what we see is by convention that the slaveholders are withholding literacy. And if you read Pennington's narrative, or Frederick Douglass's narrative, or Tubman, or any of the narratives from Maryland, they talk about being severely beaten for being found in the book. Josiah Henson was so severely whipped for having a speller that he kept in his hat that he never touched a book again until he was 50 years old. And as a 50-year-old man, his child is trying to teach him to read, and his child is teaching him like he's a moron, because can you imagine at 50, like trying to learn a new language? So these anti-literacy laws are something that, again, when I advocate for a complex and a complicated geography, we don't usually look at very carefully. So you see on the one hand this narrative, this poor, degraded slaves, and these people are ignorant, and they, on one hand. And then on the other, you say to yourself, if these people are so degraded and so ignorant, why do you need laws to withhold literacy? Literacy should be something that's not available. And yet what we see is time and again, people like Douglass are teaching themselves how to read. And when you see that, they're burning down schools. This is Prudence Crandall's school burned. You see over and over again that arson is a weapon of destruction. And so many times, almost every place I go, there's a fire, and I do understand that we have burning embers fires, and this is the way we're heating our structures, and so fires are going to be more prevalent. But we also know that this is one of the real problems when you start to look at education. Well, to be literate is actually an act of sedition. And so when you look and you see here that Philip Snowden is coming out, and what does he say? He reads well, but he writes indifferently. So that literacy means that it's important enough that I'm going to spend my money letting you know in an ad that this man is literate. So you start to understand that literacy is an act of sedition. It's an act that allows you to really come out of slavery in a way that we wouldn't normally understand. And if you look here, you'll see that this is, I tried to keep it from Montgomery County. You see that he's got he's a free pass. So people who are literate, there's multiple forms of literacy. You can know your alphabet and you can sound out some letters. You can read simple words, maybe 1 or 2 syllables. You can then read fully, but you can't write. And of the two, writing is much more seditious than reading on some level. So when we read, I can take in what you want me to know. I can ingest new ideas. But when I can write, like David Walker, I can send out seditious ideas on my own. So literacy is truly, truly a very important aspect to this work, and it's something that we don't always think about in terms of how should we really manage to think about what it means for the Quaker religion and for Quakers to be so dedicated to education. So, I've been in Swarthmore, I've been many of your Quaker colleges, and I know that your schools, even today, the president's children are going to a Quaker school, if we think about it from that level. So that the education that's here, that you provided at Sandy Spring, that I see around the country, because almost every single church, Black church, that I am looking at has a school. So public schools actually come out of Sabbath schools. So Sabbath schools today are Sunday schools. And so your first line of education came from Sunday school, and the Bible was often your first reader. And so for Quakers to have this as one of the basic tenets and precepts of their approach is really very important. And I know, because I have been here before, that the manumission and the manumission papers are very important to this community. But for me, that's fraught with a double-edged sword. Because if you hold someone in slavery your whole life and then manumit them at their death, that tells me you knew what you were doing. And so whenever anyone talks about benevolence and these benevolent deathbed manumissions, I just have to control myself because it needs to be complicated. If you knew it was wrong at your death, you knew it was wrong before. You're trying to bargain your way into heaven. And you're trying to bargain your way into heaven by releasing people that you held in slavery for all of their lives. And so it's an issue. So here in Sandy Spring, when I look at the discussion around Underground Railroad, one of the things that I see is, well, we don't have much documented evidence. This is what the folklore says. This is what, this is how we think about it, but we don't have this concrete evidence, which again is why I map things. So I was looking through my papers and I went back, and you don't have to read all of this, but down here they start to talk about these Quaker settlements. As I said, when you write, you get to influence a historical record because it's something tangible, it's something solid, we can see it. So he's talking about these Quaker settlements, and he's talking about where people go and how they're moved. Quakers, because you're a farmer, but they were farmers, often have what's called false bottom wagons. And so the wagons are two-tiered. You'll lay on the first tier, you put something over it, some hay or whatever produce, and then there's the second tier. So you can move great amounts of people in these false bottom wagons, and we see it all the time coming out of these farming communities. And he talks more about the kinds of teams that there are. You know, people are passing into the slave states, into the free states. These kinds of records I treasure because it's before 1980 when Charles Blockson brings the Underground Railroad to the national attention. I like these things when people are talking about this in 1850 and 1840 and much long before it's popular, and actually before the Underground Railroad has gotten a lot of notoriety because people are working in secret. And so they're kind of the evidence that we're talking about is not necessarily to the fore at this point. So when you look at the modern maps of the Underground Railroad, in part because Sandy Spring has long been in the narrative. It's always been talked about. So when you get up into these areas up in here, you're going to see Sandy Spring is listed. People coming up, going into areas into Pennsylvania. I just finished a manuscript talking about Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, and was struck by the fact that they think that one of the routes out of Sandy Spring was up through Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could actually tie my own research together with Sandy Spring and Pennsylvania? But you see that people are coming out, they're following fairly well understood routes at this point. But the new map that I would like to see really starts to name these African American communities. On Sandy Spring is both. So, and that does happen. So that this is the kind of thing that we, my field is heavily mapped, but we don't have maps. It's a hard, let me see if I can explain this. So in every book, I've probably got 6, 8 maps in my book. Every book on the Underground Railroad that I ever picked up has maps in it, but there are no maps. They're almost always inside of books explaining what the local understanding is. And so the majority of our work is inside of these different manuscripts and books that are being passed along. But this is something that we really have to kind of understand. How are we going to think about this? How are we going to think about Sandy Spring and its relationship to the Underground Railroad? So you see, when we start to question, if I were to do an in-depth study of Sandy Spring, which I'm not doing, but if I were, I would start to look, well, here's Dorsey, I know that's a name from up here. Here's Stabler, I think that's a name from up here, near Brookville. So I know I'm in your region now, right? So that I would begin to try to understand, who are these people? What does this mean? And can I make any connections? So that it's one of these things that we have to kind of think about when we're doing this kind of work is how to really come at it from a creative point of view. How can we think differently? How can we actually generate, as someone said to me, a new word, inspiration. How can we have some inspiration around this? I just love it. And the people who are solving problems, we're calling them solutionaries. So how can we be an inspirative solutionary around this topic? Because this is what we need. We need new thinking. We need new approaches. I know, I can say this without a doubt, that I know that Sandy Spring is an Underground Railroad space for both blacks and whites, for Quakers and the free black community. I have no doubt in my mind. But to bring that into the level of credibility and acceptance, where the National Park Service would accept it without any question, requires a lot of work and a lot of documentation. How do we get at that? How do we do it? So we can look, and there are all these different kinds of ways in which we can begin to think about you know, that these people are coming from all these different places. And in this case, they say he may be lurking, one of my favorite 19th century words. He may be lurking in the area of Sandy Spring, which means not only are people escaping from, but they're escaping to. So this is a real transit place. I wasn't going to say this, but I am going to say it. I was in the office of the regional director for the National Park Service for the Northeast region. This is before we could scan and photocopy and do things really quickly. And I saw some paperwork from Sandy Spring, and next to it on a church ledger, it said gone to Canada. And I can't figure out what that document was that I saw, but I know that people are both leaving and coming, that you're having multiple things going on here. It's not just a haven where people are arriving, but this is still a slave state. And Montgomery County is still a county that is pro-slavery. There would be many reasons to want to leave. And so you have both of these things happening at the same time. So you have a map here that I took from a report that I found online, and they're starting to talk about this as a possible Underground Railroad site. So that you have, as I said, from the so if I didn't have that Timbuktu sign, I could use this map. Okay, you have your church, you have your cemetery. I know you have your Black community here, even though it's not written there. You have the components that I need to think about. Okay, the next one. And so again, I'm very wedded to topographic maps that show elevation and depression, because African Americans are almost never on flat land. And there are a lot of things I can say about them, but flat land isn't one of them. And if they're on flat land, trust me, it's because nobody wants flat land. You want to have a hill. And so that's always the case. And so when you start to look here in the area where we know African Americans have lived historically, you can begin to understand what's going on. If I were to walk that land, if I were to really do a geographic study like I normally do, I always know when I get where I'm going, because I'm either going up a hill or going down a hill. And so these are the kinds of things, when you have this sort of map, you can start to look at the relationships, how these things all work together. So this would be, along with the other map and this one. And then when I was researching something else, this is a letter to Wilbert Siebert, one of the main sort of historian of the Underground Railroad, a white Harvard-trained historian who mapped much of the white community, but missed much of the Black community. And in here, he says that one of the havens on the Underground Railroad was a colored woman named Harriet Smallwood. This is whom he names. It's the only person he names. So that we see Alan Falk here. It's down Farquhar. You know that name? Okay. Well, there you go. So Alan says, I was young, but what did someone say?
Her great-grandfather.
Oh, okay, so we need to talk, eh? So Alan writes, and I was researching something else. I was actually researching a Canadian site, and John Brown, when this popped up in a reel of microfilm. I think there were other things there. This is reel C of the Siebert papers, if you want to know where this was. And I didn't have time to go through all of it, but there's more there where they're talking about Sandy Spring. So that we know that these are the kinds of things and the kinds of evidence that I would use. And this is just a close-up of what he's saying, because at that point, the house was still standing. And I want to just say this. And I'm not volunteering myself to do the work. So this is not why I'm saying this. I'm an archaeologist, as I said, because almost the most important things are not standing. The longer we wait, the fewer times we're going to have an instance where somebody can raise their hand and say, that's actually in my family. The longer we wait to do this work, the more fleeting the evidence becomes. And so I have watched in my own time period buildings being destroyed. That anecdotal map that I showed you, Coy Robbins, he's dead. Many of the churches that he has there in that are gone. I have a report from Sandy Spring, and when they're talking about one of the early buildings in the colored school, it was still standing at that time. So that if we're going to, if you are going to, if you are going to really finally put this question to rest about how did the Underground Railroad actually work in Sandy Spring, these are some of the things I think you would look at. So we've talked about the cemetery. You would get the names, you know what they are already. We've talked about the original people who lived in this region. We've talked about the school. We've talked about the church. You would look at the church rosters. You would look at where people went. And you would look at all of these different lines of evidence and come up with an integrated narrative that intertwines Quaker activism, Black activism, community activism, church activism. You would intertwine the Quakers, the Methodists, and the AME. You would intertwine the men and the women and come up with a story that contributes mightily to the narrative. And I know at Woodlawn Barn, which is mostly there because the barn is great, not because it had an Underground Railroad story per se, but you have the story here. And it's been something that I have really found to be extremely compelling, although, as I've said to you, it's I've never looked at it in the ways in which I would really like to look at it. So I'm going to close with this. I had said to you that this is a map that's in the book, and this is a map that I used to prove my point, so that I ended up with all of those Black churches, all of Wilbur Siebert's roots and his kinds of where he said people went. I took the routes that Siebert pointed out. I took the known Underground Railroad sites, I put them in. I put the known sites of Black settlements, I put them in. I took the known AME church, in this case we would look at Quaker churches and Black churches together. I took all of these settlements that have all of these components and put a bullseye there, and then I connected them. And what did I find? That they almost parallel Wilbur Siebert's map through Indiana. And in areas like this, we know that we draw straight lines, but people don't travel in straight lines. And so I would suggest that, I'm looking at another route right here. You see that? So this is what we draw, but this is probably what happened. You see that? So this is what we draw, but this is probably what happened. You see it there? And the last thing I'll say about the map is that you'll see that it's heavily populated in the southern regions because this is the most dangerous part when you're coming out of slavery. Southern Illinois, southern Indiana, southern Ohio, right at that kind of upper south, lower north border. And so the closer you are to danger, the blacker your sites are. In other words, African Americans are on that front line of danger. When you get way up here in the Cass County and into them, you'll see that the kinds of density diminishes because you don't need it as much. People can spread out, they're even safe, they settle in these places at times. And so that when you look at the maps and how the Underground Railroad works, I'm sure this is a very different narrative than you're used to. So that I'm talking about dogs and shivering people and, running away through the thicket. No, I'm talking about people who plan. I'm talking about people who used compasses. William Still used a telegraph. That there is a much more complicated and complex history to be told, not just about the Underground Railroad, because the other thing that I've been saying as I move around the country is that African American history itself needs to be received and interpreted on a much more complex level. So, having said that, I'll put in a plug for the new museum because I did work on the cultural expressions. So the museum is a space where they're trying to get at some of this more complicated narrative, where we're actually trying to talk about one cohesive narrative of African American history. I can tell you from the people at the Smithsonian, they are completely overwhelmed. They have never had a response like this. I think we're now out to March before you can get in without a time ticket. That the response has been staggering. And I would invite every one of you to make it your business to put yourself inside of that structure, wear comfortable shoes, and you need to come back at least 3 times. It's so very deep in its presentation of history. And so I'm just kind of speaking about one small slice of African American history and how Sandy Spring fits into that narrative. And so thank you for your listening and thank you for coming.